Welcome back to Business Talk here on businesstech.co.za, where we unpack the biggest issues shaping South African business. I'm Michael Avery, and today we're talking about something that I think keeps many CEOs awake at night, many CIOs on LinkedIn, and hackers very well fed. And we're talking about cybersecurity. And if you felt recently like every second week there's a new press release beginning with, "We regret to inform you that," well, you're not really wrong. I think South Africa is now ranked among the top targets for cybercrime globally. And at this point, even our data breaches, it feels, are reaching crisis levels. So to help us make sense of this security wake-up call and whether we're dealing with a data drizzle or an outright deluge, we're joined by someone who actually knows what she's talking about, Lutfiyyah Ahmed, who's head of advisory at Resilient Innovations, an attorney, a privacy specialist, a consulting lead, and co-chair of Women in Security and Privacy. So, Lutfiyyah, it's great to have you on at this time when I think cybersecurity, and we saw it over the Black Friday weekend. I think one of the big banks went down. I mean, there was lots of concerns. So let's just start right at the top. The information regulator has basically raised its head and said, folks, things are getting worse. So I think it's fair to say we're not just in a cyber rainstorm, but a full-blown disaster. Paint the picture for us. What are you seeing out there?
Sure. Thanks, Michael. I think globally, South Africa is actually one of the most targeted for cyber crimes. When we look at some of the stats from the information regulator, within the last about year or so, there's been about 2,000 reported breaches. And that's roughly about 200 or so a month. And that's, again, just the reported. And with that report coming out, there was an increase of roughly, I think, 40% or so, being an increase in cyber attacks. And again, that's just what has been reported. When we look at that, most of the driving factor is actually coming from a lot of outdated systems, a lot of weak foundational controls as well. So I think with our backing, we look at, okay, yes, there's going to be fragmented information security, investment into certain projects, but then we fail to sometimes realize the foundational controls. And again, why I'm sort of going onto the foundational controls element is because when we look at what the actual causes of some of the breaches were, it's stuff like weak passwords, lack of multi-factor authentication. So it is sort of more of the basic controls more than anything, which is then also a major concern if we're not getting the basics right.
And it really is. It's the hygiene factors. And, you know, you can look at how the Springboks managed to turn things around. And when Rassie took over back in 2017-18, he said, let's get the basics right before we can even think about wanting to be the best team in the world. And I think when you look at your cybersecurity, you've got to get those basics right. You can't have employees using 1, 2, 3, 4 as passwords anymore. I know, Lutfiyyah, you've really emphasized that we really need a culture shift in how South Africans think about cybersecurity and privacy. So in your view, why is the mindset change that the missing piece of that puzzle to get the basics right?
So maybe if I take a step back and explain what I understand culture shift to be. For me, that is actually embedding it into the practice of your business. How you would actually practically show the behavioral change of adopting privacy and security. So a lot of times organizations tend to deploy trainings and then say, okay, yes, our organization has privacy and security awareness campaigns, etc. And we're missing the mark in terms of, I don't know if you've ever done training, and I know some of my friends that would do training, if it's not completely relevant to their job description, it sort of goes over their heads. They're doing the training to meet a KPI, and there's nothing sort of substance missing really. So with the culture shift, that is the change in behavior. And I'm such an advocate for privacy by design and default and security by design and default. That's actually embedded into your processes, what you should do from a security and privacy perspective. So as day-to-day business, when you are doing or running your operations, it's already built in. And I think that's the kind of shift that would drive a better security and privacy program and initiatives, really.
Again, it's about living the defense, the security mindset, rather than just saying, right, you've completed an hour long continuous professional development course and you've watched a video and you can tick a box and then move on. Because I agree with you. I think so often when we hear security, we're on deadlines. It's almost the end of the year. You think, oh no, not another thing that's going to delay me getting this other thing that I need to do out and delivered. But really, it is foundational. So I think it's such a fantastic point you raised. Sorry, I just wanted to interject on that. Go ahead.
No, I was actually going to say with the trainings, like we're deploying again these trainings, but they're not relevant for the audience necessarily. It's such a basic way that I don't know as someone in HR or someone in marketing what it actually means for me and my operations. So that role-based element is also quite important when you are deploying trainings. Also, probably smaller groups to allow discussions and asking questions and more engagement around the content and the requirements and why it's applicable to me in an organization. I think that would drive more meaningful adoption of understanding and being able to practice privacy and security practically, really.
So how does one do that then? I mean, let's pick up on that. Doing it practically, making it relevant for my role or my particular piece of the puzzle in the broader cybersecurity defense wall that we're trying to put up. I know you've been a big advocate for simulation exercises. So what are we talking? Doing more fire drills of cyber incidents? How would that work, and how would you advise corporates to start thinking about making it more relevant to the staff on the ground?
I think simulation exercises are probably one of the most slept on security measures. Um, I think from a simulation exercise point of view, that's actually taking your theoretical documentation and practically applying it. And when you do that practical application, you're also doing that test for, is it actually fit for purpose? And am I going to be able to, in the event of a real life scenario, be able to implement these measures appropriately? And taking large scenarios like ransomware, for example, you think, oh, yes, it's every day occurring. I'm going to be able to put a team together and they're going to be able to manage whatever gets thrown their way. Um, but then things like, am I ready from a Bitcoin perspective? Do I have a negotiator? A lot of those things that seem like basic knowledge ends up being missed and or lost in translation and get picked up in those types of exercises. So simulation exercises are so important from that practical element and identifying those gaps for your organization. I think a lot of that also gets swept away. Think you're saying, oh, well, now that's going to be an additional burden for my team to now go and get this exercise prepared, work together with someone to get this deployed. A lot of times those exercises are also going to be aimed more at your excos or your board levels. And I think there's some uneasiness there because it could be releasing some uncomfortable truths of lack of preparedness or readiness. But that's where you need to be. When you're doing that in a simulation exercise, you're identifying the gap before that breach comes through. And then that situation, you don't want to be caught not being prepared enough. So I think there's a lot of value in just having simulation exercises and doing that practically and being more prepared.
Yeah, you remind me of an example. I think it was shared at this year's IT Web Security Summit, speaking about doing those simulation exercises at board level of a company. It was a real world example that, had done some of that training at executive level, but they hadn't then role played or scenario planned what happened if the person who was really in charge of dealing with us from a board perspective wasn't there. And what happened? It just so happened that they were hit when one of their senior executives was away on holiday with their family. And so there wasn't that plan B and that ability to now say, okay, who do we call? How do we deal with this? How do we sure we get ahead of the media narrative? And it was a hugely stressful event for those executives, and one that left deep scars, post-traumatic stress. I mean, this was a really human story. And I think often when we think about cyber, we actually don't think about this is crime that's being perpetuated here, and it has a lasting psychological toll as well. So, if you're a leader, if you're watching right now and you're wondering, okay, right, we've got to start moving. I mean, this is 2025, we're heading into 2026. Where do we even start? If they're thinking we've been a bit behind the curve, what are the practical steps that I, as a leader in my organization, can take to shift from maybe a tick box compliance mentality to building actual resilience?
So I think really getting the basics right. And when I'm saying getting the basics right, things like making sure you have up to date asset registers is so important. And I think we drop the ball on that, trying to put in preventative measures, and then we don't understand our landscape of what we're trying to protect. So having those up to date asset registers, I think I go into a lot of organizations and I see a lot of disparate views, and then that's not going to be well, you've already lost your key foundational step in your process of what you're trying to actually safeguard. So definitely again, get the basics right. I think what one of the shortfalls is with getting the basics right, and also that compliance checkbox, is a lot of times you're reporting into an audit committee. Your audit committee wants things done now, and there's no appreciation for the effort and the amount of time it takes to get some of these foundational elements right. And then we want to jump to preventative responding, and it ends up being reactive. So getting the right people in, getting those foundational measures correct in the time frame that you need is really important. Even if it is those smaller steps, I understand risk based, you need these things in place fairly quickly, but you don't want it to be a very disparate view or something that's not practical for or and fit for purpose, because then it defies the purpose of why you're doing it anyways. So I think that's one of the key elements: get the basics right, and then simulation exercises. I mean, you're talking about the IT web simulation exercise and some of the downfalls of what were identified. If I think of one exercise that was conducted that was actually not just a walkthrough or desktop exercise, it was actually going and testing a battle box. And then some of the executives were like, oh, wow, I actually don't remember the password for my physical battle box. So I have one in place, which is a good practice, but now I've not tested for so long that I don't know the password. So in the event of a disruption, that would have been such a critical step that now you don't have access to anything. So that is also good practice. Just test. Make sure you're well prepared and planned. Make sure you're getting every domain. That's good practice as well. So identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. It needs to be that holistic program.
I'm a big fan of doing that, and real world simulations and fire drills and testing all the time. And depending on your organizational culture, sometimes you can gamify it to an extent. You can have a bit of fun with it. You can have a leaderboard. Just again, it depends on the organizational culture largely. But to your earlier point, you've got to start at the top, having this culture of defense that's really embedded in the DNA of the organization. And I've seen big organizations, financial services firms, who suffered immense reputational harm because of data breaches, because this is a trust that's broken with you and your client. I mean, you're an admitted attorney, you specialize in privacy, so you've got a foot in both worlds, in law and cybersecurity. How well do South African organizations understand the privacy implications of breaches? And do you still feel that many underestimate POPIA until something goes wrong?
100%. I think people still have a very skewed understanding of what personal information is, why I use personal information. I still hear people saying that you need consent to use personal information, and there's no larger appreciation for basic things again, like data management. So I think we look at a lot of things siloed. We're not looking at privacy from a records management perspective, from a broader data protection perspective into information security. And all of these things actually need to speak to each other. They do need to be combined. Like if I think of privacy, for me, privacy is more the regulation, how to handle information. And that leans more to data management practices as well. So there's a big overlap there, and teams seem to be working together in that regard. And then there's also the data protection element, which touches on the data security side of things. So all of those need to come into play with, again, the legal aspect and the minimum requirements, because at the end of the day, those are the safeguards. And what I particularly like about privacy legislation is there's a security safeguards portion that says implement what's appropriate and reasonable for your organization. And I think maybe that's also what trips up a lot of organizations. I want to put in best practice, but is it fit for my purpose? Is it appropriate for my environment? And is it based on my risk appetite? I think that's also probably part of the basics. Understanding your risk appetite, understanding what you should put in place for your organization.
And I think cybersecurity, to that point, is often delegated downward. Oh, IT will handle it. From your advisory work, what shifts when executives and boards actually take ownership of cyber risk and they realize and that light bulb moment gets switched on?
I'm so glad you're asking this question because, again, in one of the simulation exercises where we had an exco present, they realized that shift in that simulation exercise, knowing that, well, I'm actually the decision maker. I need to say, yes, you have budget for this. Yes, you have budget for that. Okay, I need to make a decision on whether I'm going to pay the ransomware or not. And if there's a breakdown, it's not just the system, it could also be human error. So there's so many dynamics to it. And it comes out in those simulation exercises when you're making it practical. So definitely, again, I'm going to my default of simulation exercises on that one.
And you also co-chair Women in Security and Privacy, as I said in my intro. So I think you've got a very strong focus on things like talent and representation and capacity building. Where do you see the biggest gaps when it comes to people skills inside an organization? And how can we make cybersecurity, and you've mentioned it, feel less like this kind of technical silo and, oh, something I have to do, and more like a kind of shared responsibility inside the business?
I think for me, especially coming from a law firm background and then into consulting where I was exposed to cyber, I didn't fully understand what it entailed. And a lot of women in security and privacy have similar stories in terms of I didn't understand what cyber was. I didn't know cyber was an option for me into the working environment. So a lot of what we do is also around empowering not just women, but underrepresented communities. We want to get that messaging around what cyber actually is, that there's probably a space for anyone in cyber, because just like how I'm saying, it's not just IT's responsibility. There's touch points with cyber at basically every point. So if you're someone that's keen on a cyber career as well, come join the party. There's probably a space for you in some of the domain.
Well, it's a fantastic message. I'm, a big believer. You've got to see it to be it. So, especially, woman in any IT or STEM profession, the more you see leaders in positions of authority talking about it, I think the more you open up, pathways to younger females or younger minority groups who are mis or underrepresented to say, right, there's a career there for me. And again, I think it just builds resilience, because any organization that is only looking at things with one particular view clearly is not getting the benefits of diversity and the different perspectives that can say, hey, have you thought about this or that? I think it really is critical. Just one last question. We're talking at a time when things just seem to be moving so quickly. And I think, if I'm in the cyber world right now, I look at AI, I think, gosh, you can now spoof someone, you can clone their voice, you can put it in an LLM, you can make it sound so convincing. What keeps you awake at night when you look ahead into 2026? What's the cyber threat or the behavior or the blind spot that keeps you awake and says, oh, we've got to get ahead of this?
I think it's probably that we are still stuck in, even when we come to training and awareness, we're still saying, look for suspicious links, look for this that won't look right. And now with the adoption of AI, all of these, I actually saw a phishing email recently, and it had the signature of the person that was sending. It was from the email address of the person. There's so many things that may have made um, phishing attacks and other cyber attacks using AI tools so real. Just like your deep fakes and your voice calls, a lot of this is so much more real. And I think trainings and awareness haven't quite adapted just yet. So I think again, it's that awareness portion, but from a meaningful perspective to and I think it's even within privacy legislation. If there's updates and stuff, make your organizations aware of it. And I don't think that's being done enough. So I might be aware of it, but does everyone else know that there's actually all of these changes?
Yeah, very good point. And I think often when we domain specialists, it's very easy to assume that everyone should know this or be aware of this, and that's very rarely the case. Well, that brings us to the end of today's conversation. I think a very timely reminder that in a world where cyber criminals don't take holidays, South African organizations simply can't afford to treat cybersecurity like a New Year's resolution for next year. A big thank you to Lutfiyyah Ahmed, who's a head of advisory at Resilient Innovations, for really cutting through a lot of the jargon and giving us the kind of practical insights that could save our data bacon at the end of the day. Remember, if you missed any part of the discussion, you can catch the full interview on businesstech.co.za. And don't forget to subscribe to Business Talk for more conversations with the leaders shaping South Africa's digital and economic future. I'm Michael Avery. Take care.